Thank you. Hello. Again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here today in our February 2024 community call. And it's our first community call this year. So it's always a great way to start the year. So our topic today is how PIDs work together in the research ecosystem. Next slide, please. And I'm sure you all are familiar with our faces already. So we have Sheila, of course, our program, is a senior strategist for research infrastructure programs. Myself, Paulo Guhilde, the strategist for Orchid US community. And many of you already know that Kayla joined us last year, but Kayla Ramhit is our newest member of the Orchid US community team. And and Kayla is our program assistant for the community. Next slide, please. All right, so today our agenda is we will go through some topics about PIDs, of course, and why we should care about PIDs. Then we will take a look at PIDs in the research ecosystem and how they work together and, stakeholder roles in ensuring PID connections. And we will also finally have at the end is we'll do a question and discussion. All right, so what is a persistent identifier? It is a globally unique, persistent, and machine resolvable identifier. A PID should have an associated metadata that identifies and disambiguate between entities. So think about identifying a person, an object, or an organization. Throughout the year, Throughout the years, we use DOIs to identify an article, an object, and that is always the same. So the idea of persistent through the years. There are multiple PIDs or persistent identifiers out there that is available today. However, for our discussion today, we will focus on ORCID for people, DOI, of course, for objects or things, and ROAR for organizations. Next slide. So the question of why are PIDs important? PIDs are important because it allows us to ambiguously identify people, organizations, and things. So the idea of the who, the what, and where. Next slide. PID allows us to make connections and see relationships between various entities. So the graphic that you are seeing here illustrates the relationship between people, organizations, and things. So it's very colorful. There's a lot of connections. All these connections through PIDs makes research and scholarly resources more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So for short, the idea of fair. Next slide. PIDs enable a better understanding of research activity. For example, the ORCID US Community Data Visualization Tool, which Sheila will talk more about later, created this map you are seeing here. So this map is showing you collaborations of Caltech researchers across the globe. PIDs made this representation possible because we can disambiguate people, things, and places, thus helping us, our home and organizations, get a better idea of research, of reach, impact, and return on investment. And even now, PIDs are becoming even more important as funders, including the federal government, the White House OSTP memo, for example, and related federal developments in the last few years are encouraging and or even requiring persistent identifiers in federally research activities as a means of ensuring scientific and research integrity. And now I'm going to pass it on to Sheila to give us additional details and talk more about our topic today.
Great, thanks, Paolo. So following on with looking at the White House OSTP public access memo as really just one example of how PIDs can kind of work together in the research ecosystem, we have this graphic where we're going to start with the federally funded research outputs as kind of the central thing that we're looking at here. And this is just an example, but in the memo, there's a whole section about persistent identifiers and how that should apply. And so you can go and read the text word for word, but we kind of took it and interpreted into this artist rendition. So let's follow this through. So if we start with the federally funded research outputs, we should be assigning persistent identifiers to those. The most common would be DOIs. And within the metadata of those DOIs, we would use ORCID IDs to identify the researcher or the researchers involved in creating those outputs. And within our DOI metadata and within our ORCID metadata, hopefully we would have that researcher's employer organization identified with a ROR ID or Research Organization Registry ID. Furthermore, we would have the funder also identified with a ROR ID. Up until recently, funders have had their own persistent identifier called the Crossref Funder ID or FundRef that some people might be familiar with. Currently, my understanding is those are kind of getting migrated to ROR, so all types of research organizations will be identified with ROR IDs. But you may come across a Crossref researcher or a Crossref funder ID or FundRef. But that would be indicated also in the DOI metadata, so the funding organization. And then the grant itself can have an identifier assigned to it, namely a Crossref grant DOI. So most people are familiar with DOIs for publications and articles and stuff like that. But over the last couple of years, a DOI for grants has been a thing that many funders are starting to use to better disambiguate funding awards, individual funding awards. And then finally, other related works will also hopefully have DOIs, and those related DOIs or other types of identifiers would be included as related resources in the DOI metadata of the federally funded research outputs. So this is kind of somewhat simplistic. There could be exceptions and things here, but in general, this is what we're talking about when we talk about different PIDs or persistent identifiers being kind of connected to each other. And this is just the example that we pulled out from the White House OSTP public access memo, because we know a lot of people are looking at that, and it's kind of helping to define some best practices. So we're going to be talking about PIDs in kind of the research life cycle and how they work together. What we're going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about is not necessarily comprehensive. There are definitely going to be things missing or other things that I'm not saying. So if you notice something missing, or if you have more ideas or even questions, put those into the chat, because we're going to have time for discussion and we'll get more into this. What I'm presenting here is just some initial food for thought to spark ideas and get discussion going. What we're looking at on the screen right here is actually an interactive graphic that from More Brains that's showing PIDs across the research life cycle. And I do recommend going into that link and playing around, and you can click on the different arrows and it will show you, what persistent identifiers come into play at what stages of the life cycle. So I think this is a great resource to explore. And just looking at the kind of steps that we're going to cover today, most people think of funding as step one, but there's actually kind of a step 0 before that, which is affiliations, and I'll go into each one of these individually. So affiliations, funding, conducting research, sharing research outputs, peer review, and research activity reporting. So let's go through these. So starting with the idea of the 0 or the affiliations, before any kind of uh, applications for funding or anything like that get started, ideally, any organizations that actually employ researchers would be making sure that their researchers have ORCID IDs to identify themselves and adding employment information to their researchers' ORCID records, which would include the ROR ID for the employing organization. So here's an example of what that looks like. This is a snapshot of an employment entry in somebody's ORCID record. And you can see that the ROR identifier is present there in that ORCID record metadata. Same thing for education, organizations that educate researchers, most likely for, grad students, PhD students, those kinds of researchers would have ORCID IDs, and the organization could add education information to those researchers' ORCID records too, also including the ROR ID for your organization. So again, another example from ORCID of an education entry where the ROR ID of the institution is included there. So basically thinking about any connections that involve an individual's affiliation with an organization would be recorded in the person's ORCID record, and the ROR ID for the organization would be present. And there can be other types of affiliations too. So any organization that has researchers affiliated with it, like societies and associations or just different research groups, can also play a role in encouraging researchers to have ORCID IDs, and things like membership, service, invited positions, and distinctions can be added to researchers' ORCID records too, always including the ROR ID for the organization. So looking at the funding part of the workflow here, when a researcher applies for and receives funding, there are different roles that can be played by different stakeholders. So from the funder perspective, the funder can ask the researcher for their ORCID ID during that application process. And the funder, depending on the software systems that they're using, can also allow the researcher to import data from their ORCID record into their funding application and progress reports to kind of help save time and reduce administrative burden. So the screenshots that you're seeing on this page on the left is from a funding system called Proposal Central that allows researchers to log in using their ORCID ID. There are many software systems that allow for that, which is helpful. And then on the right, it's a screenshot from Science CV, which is used by the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy, and other federal agencies to get a bio sketch for applicants. So I think many people are familiar that researchers can actually choose ORCID as an external source to populate their Science CV biosketch. Also, when giving out the funding, it would be great if funders would be assigning a grant DOI to each grant award that they give out. And a grant DOI, like a DOI for anything else, has metadata behind it. So the researcher's ORCID ID can be included in that grant DOI metadata. The researcher's employer's ROR ID can be included there. And this, again, kind of helps connect this information together. So it helps to connect that funding award with the awardee, their home organization, and also research outputs resulting from that award can be indicated in the grant DOI metadata too, and vice versa. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But just to give you some visuals here, this is an example of an ORCID ID included in a grant DOI metadata. So American Heart Association is requiring ORCID IDs from their applicants and awardees, and they're assigning grant DOIs to their awards. So this is a landing page for their grant, one of their grants, and you can see that the the PI's ORCID ID is included there, meaning that it's also included in the metadata. And then actually showing some XML here for the ROR ID. So this is an example of the lead investigator who got this grant. Their organization is identified with a ROR ID, so that's completely clear what organization they're affiliated with. And I'm showing this in the XML because with ROR, a lot of the times, the ROR ID is kind of on the back end or in the background. So, for example, if an individual is working on their application and they have to select what or type in or something what their organization that they're affiliated with is, it's usually in the systems that have ROR integrated, the ROR ID shows up on the background, but the researcher doesn't necessarily see the ROR ID. They just see the name of their institution that's linked to the ROR ID in the background. So that's an example of that. And additionally, when award is granted, that funding information can be added to the researcher's ORCID record to confirm that that researcher did receive that funding from the organization. And ideally, the grant DOI would be included in that funding entry in ORCID. So here's an example of a funding entry in ORCID that was added to somebody's ORCID record by American Heart Association. And you can tell that because the source is American Heart Association. But also importantly, AHA has included the grant DOI for this award in the metadata that they added to ORCID. So this is all helping to kind of link these things together. The researcher also has a role to play during the funding workflow. So if they're asked for their ORCID ID, they should provide it. If they have the ability to use their ORCID data to populate their applications and progress reports, go ahead and do that. If a data management plan is required, there are certain platforms, namely the DMP tool, that will automatically assign a DOI to the data management plan and write it to your ORCID record for you. So consider doing that if possible. And if asked to authorize the funder as a trusted party on their ORCID record, go ahead and do that, because that means the funder will be able to add information to their ORCID record. And if you're a researcher and your grant has a DOI assigned to it, make a note of that, because as the researcher, your responsibility is going to be providing that grant DOI information to your publisher or repository when you share your outputs, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So thinking about conducting research, this will really kind of vary depending on discipline. So there are several kind of discipline-specific PIDs. So this is kind of just a general, very high-level overview here. But if you have experience with more discipline-specific research, please add things into the chat and we can talk about them. So if the researcher is somebody who is working with clinical trials or something where they want to register their study, a DOI can be assigned to a study registration. So that's something to keep in mind. I think something very common is, of course, using and noting the DOIs of reference materials, other articles, and things like that that might be cited in a final publication. And also DOIs can be assigned to things like instruments and software and other types of resources. So for a researcher, depending on what kinds of materials they're going to be using or interacting with during the course of their research, there may be other identifiers to note. If a researcher is using special equipment, facilities, or other resources, labs, different things, especially facilities and equipment that they have to apply to use or get permission to use, the organization that's providing access to those resources ideally would be collecting the researcher's ORCID ID when they applied to use that resource. And then the organization can add that research resource usage information to the researcher's ORCID record. And this will kind of help to, again, tie things together in terms of keeping track of who's using these resources and for what research. So here's an example of the research resources section of ORCID. This section can only be essentially populated by an organization. So as an individual, I can't go into my ORCID record and add this information myself. So if you haven't seen this section on your ORCID record, that's why you have to be actively using some sort of facility where the organization is writing this to ORCID. So this is an example from a researcher's ORCID record where they were working with the Environmental Molecular Sciences Lab, or EMSL, to use those facilities as part of their research. So you can see that there's a DOI linked to the project here, and also the ROR ID for EMSL. So depending on what the research is, different identifiers can be linked within this also to help track resource usage. When it comes to sharing research outputs, there are lots of different ways to share research outputs, but for the purposes of this intro, we'll talk about publishing or submitting something to a repository. So when a researcher is getting ready to share these materials, accurately identifying or citing their sources using the DOIs or potentially other identifiers assigned to those sources, I think that's kind of a common, well-known best practice. But it's can't remind people too much, I think. Contributors, co-authors can also be identified with their ORCID IDs. So that's always a good idea. And again, if the work was funded by some sort of grant and that grant has a DOI assigned to it, that would be a good thing for the researcher to share with their publisher or with the repository so that that grant information can be included in the DOI metadata that gets assigned to the work when it's published or made available. The publisher or repository also has a role to play here. So ideally, a DOI would get assigned to the work. And that DOI would have the researcher's ORCID IDs in the work metadata, the home organization ROR IDs in the metadata. Any works cited or related works would be included as related identifiers in the DOI metadata. The grant DOI, if it's there, would be included, and also the ROR ID for the funding organization. And just as a little bit of a side note, just again, emphasizing that there are lots of other types of outputs besides publications or data sets, and different ways to share these things. This is a list of all the different types of resources that data site DOIs, for example, can be assigned to. So anything from software to a sound. I mean, you just never know. Model, the output management plan is for data management plans and other related things. So there are lots of possibilities here for the types of outputs. And just again, showing some visual examples. So this is a screenshot from a work landing page or an article landing page that has a DOI. And you can see at least one of the authors. There were multiple authors, but in the screenshot, you're seeing the ORCID ID for one of the authors included here. Again, showing the ROR ID in the work DOI metadata. So the ROR ID is often kind of behind the scenes, but you can see that this is a DOI for a work. You've got the creator's name, the creator's ORCID ID, and their affiliation indicated with the ROR ID. Related work DOIs and work DOI metadata. I could have shown XML for this one, but thought a visual would be better, which basically this is the reference list for this publication, and everything that has a DOI, all these DOIs would ideally be included in the metadata of this work as related identifiers. And then this is the same landing page for that work, and it's showing the grant DOI there too. So having that included is important, and you can see the funding organization is indicated there too. So circling back to the researcher here, again, the role is, if you're asked for your ORCID ID, give it to the publisher or the repository. And researchers also can have a part to play in making sure that their works and their outputs get added to their ORCID record so that they can be accurately tied to them going forward in their career. So to do that, it's mostly authorizing DOI registration agencies, so either Crossref or DataCite, to automatically add the work information, which will include the work DOI, to their ORCID record. There are a couple of ways to do this. So for auto updates, so if a researcher wants to just have any of their works automatically added to their ORCID record, the first thing that they're going to have to do is provide their ORCID ID to the publisher or to the repository. When publishing, you're providing the ORCID ID to the publisher, and then you'll look out for a message in your ORCID inbox from Crossref. That's the example on the left over here. This is the message that a researcher will get from Crossref to authorize to say, yes, I want this work and any future works that have my ORCID ID in the DOI metadata to be added to my ORCID record automatically. And then for DataCite DOIs, the auto updates get set through the DataCite search and link wizard in ORCID. So that's the screenshot that you're seeing on the right here. In the works section of ORCID, when you go to add a work, there's an option to do search and link, and a list of databases pops up. So you would click on the DataCite one and just approve that link. And from there on, any DataCite DOIs with your ORCID ID would automatically get added to your ORCID record. And then, so that's for kind of current and future works. To claim any past works that maybe don't have your ORCID ID associated with them, you can go, and of course, this is for only works that have DOIs. You can go to the Crossref metadata search and link wizard and search for your publications and claim them to your ORCID record there. For DataCite, you would need to go to DataCite Commons and search for your work there. This screenshot here is showing that this work is already in my ORCID record, but if it wasn't, it would say add to ORCID, and there would be a button I could push to add it to my ORCID record. So here's just another example of a work in ORCID with the DOI of the work in the metadata there. And this was added by Crossref auto update. So looking at peer review, not like peer review comes at this point in the cycle, but just covering it in general. If it's peer review for a publication, the publisher should ask for the peer reviewer's ORCID ID and add that peer review activity to the reviewer's ORCID records. And then the researcher who's doing the review should provide their ORCID ID and authorize that publisher to add their review to ORCID. I'll show an example of what that looks like in a minute. It's also possible to have reviewing for grants and funding workflows. So same thing, the funder can ask for the reviewer's ORCID IDs and add review information to the reviewer's ORCID records. And if asked for this, the reviewer should provide their ORCID ID and authorize that. So within ORCID, there is a peer review section. Again, this is one that only organizations can add this information. Individuals cannot go in and add this. So it has to be kind of confirmed or specifically added by the organization. So you'll see here that this is showing peer review activity for one journal and 2 different dates of review. For people who are worried about privacy and stuff like that when it comes to like blind peer review, the amount of metadata that can be included here can be limited. So in this case, it's just showing the name of the journal. It's not showing which article this person reviewed, so it won't give away those kinds of details. And then you'll see that there's an ISSN identifying the journal, which is also a persistent identifier. And then when it comes to research activity reporting, which a lot of researchers have to do, they have to report back to their employer organization saying all the things that I did this year. People who are receiving funding also have to report back to the funder with progress reports and stuff like that. So there are some ways that PIDs can come into play during this process too. Whatever organization is asking a researcher to report back on their activities has the potential option of letting researchers use their ORCID ID and the information in their ORCID record to send that information to the organization saying, these are the things I've been up to this year, for example. This saves time so that people don't have to sit there and like manually type in all the things they've been doing. The example on the screen here is from a system called Faculty 180. This one is specifically from Boston College. And it's basically imported data from ORCID and allowing the individual to select which items they want to import into their Faculty 180 annual report. So that's great. We just kind of looked at least a broad high-level overview. I'm definitely looking forward to hearing what kinds of more detailed things people want to talk about. So that's looking at just in general the PIDs in the research lifecycle. But when it comes to creating these connections and also finding these connections, how does that work? So all of the PIDs that we talked about and PID providers that we talked about have their own API or application programming interface. And this is what really enables these PIDs to work with various different kinds of software systems and with each other. So using these APIs, you can do things like add metadata to a PID or search for and retrieve PID metadata. So they all have their own APIs and documentation associated with them. Some examples of how these APIs are being used in kind of tools or interfaces that we can all explore and work with. I mentioned DataCite Commons earlier. This is one where it's kind of this nice search interface where you can search for works, people, organizations, and whatever you search for, it will just bring up all the different connections between the works, the people, and the organizations. And those connections are available because they're assigned persistent identifiers that are connected with each other. So I do recommend everybody going in and exploring DataCite Commons if you get a chance, because it's really cool. Also, Paolo mentioned this at the beginning, but this is just another example, our data visualization resources. It's essentially a script that you can run that gets ORCID IDs for people that say they're affiliated with your organization. And then it gets the works information that's on those ORCID IDs, the cross-ref DOIs that are there, gets the co-author information in their ORCID IDs, and then creates kind of a map of collaborations. So this, again, wouldn't be possible without people having ORCID IDs and work DOIs in their ORCID record metadata. So this is one kind of picture into how those connections can be explored. And as a little bit of a side note for anyone who is administering or managing a repository, we have a service called IRIS, which is institutional repository usage statistics that makes like item views and downloads. The stats are like publicly available, so anybody can go and look at the usage of items in your repository. But what I want to highlight here is that you can get stats based on somebody's ORCID ID, so you can see usage stats for a particular author, and you can get stats for specific works that have a DOI, so you can put a DOI in to the report and get specific counts of views and downloads for those. Okay, so that kind of concludes the presentation portion. I'm going to make it so that people can unmute and turn on your video if you'd like. And I would love to hear any kind of questions or comments that people have. Let's see. I guess one thing that I wanted to mention here, you might be noticing the little icons and the PIDs that are listed on this graphic: Crossref, DataCite, ORCID, DOIs, all the kind of usual suspects, and then RORs down here too. But then there's this thing here called RAID, which is Research Activity Identifier. This is the newest PID for research projects, essentially. And it was developed by an organization in Australia. And it's kind of just up and coming. So we're actually exploring currently the potential for offering a RAID service in the US. So we didn't talk about RAID today, but this could come into play coming up in the future too.
All right, thank you, Sheila. So we do have some questions that came in via chat. So we answered some of them, but it might be good to also repeat some of those. So that would be we can go through that. All right, so let's go through some of the questions. So one of the question is, what about research resource identification? Can you talk more about that?
Yes. So we talked about the research resources section of ORCID. If I can remember where that was. Here it is. So this will really depend on what type of resource it is. There, like that screen I pulled up that showed all of the different types of items that, for example, a DataCite DOI can be assigned to. One of these could be used potentially, again, depending on what type of resource it is. There's also always this other category. So that's kind of a catch-all. So I think technically a DataCite DOI could be assigned to anything. There's also Crossref DOIs, and they have their own kind of metadata schemas and stuff like that too. So I think that's worth exploring. I know, yeah, from there, I think it really just kind of depends on what type of resource you are wanting to identify. And there may be other options too besides DOIs. So yeah. I see a hand up from Xian Yung.
Yeah, hi. I just want to bring this to this group for discussion point.
Yeah.
I understand there's some effort to consolidate PIDs, so cross review funder IDs is switching to ROR, and there are a lot of different types of DOIs. It's just there was a talk about DMPID. It's a DOI, but we call it DMPID.
Right.
And I was having a discussion about RIDs, resource identifiers, and that's pretty big in the research lab for antibodies. It can be used for cell lines. It kind of replaced the catalog number, item number kind of thing. So it's very helpful. But I understand it's not as big as DOIs, and it could be integrated into DOIs. But then wouldn't that be too big of a category? DOI can be assigned to anything. Is it really a better approach versus a kind of, we dividing into specific categories? RRIDs are very much encouraged in publishers like Cells. I mean, they actually have a start table. You have to put that in, and it's a good system. So I gave an example about v3data.org, repository database. So they have a DOI, but also they also have a RID. So a lot of times it's redundant. They'll have a DOI and then RID as two, PID. So I just want to, have this group discuss about this. What is a better approach? Do we want to have a one gigantic category for everything like a DOI, or do you want to have a more granular level of PIDs, which might be useful?
I think that's a great question, and I would love to hear thoughts from anyone on the call.
There's no reason not to have both, is there?
Yes, yes, but RID gets ignored. I mean, so like there's a like an underlying message that it's not an important PID, so we should use DOI. So if if keep ignoring, there's a subtle message that it's not as important. There's an effort to maybe disregard and switch to something else. So I want to push it to the front line. RIDs are important. So I don't know why it doesn't get mentioned as much. But is it because it's not an important PID, or is it any effort that they're trying to integrate into DOI? That's kind of question I'm raising because you guys are involved in this kind of things, PIDs.
Yes, John, go ahead.
Yeah, it's something that I was reflecting on in I think your comment about the RRIDs in the chat, and I think there are a few factors at play here. It's not to say that RRIDs are not important PIDs, especially in particular disciplines. It's that when we talk about sort of the broadest part of the PID ecosystem, we're typically talking about the sort of open infrastructure and not-for-profit organizations that are running and collaborating together on PID connections. So while ORCID IDs and DOIs and RORs are doing the good work of disambiguating each of those outputs or people or places, they're also, beyond that, connecting them together meaningfully across their APIs. So, an ORCID ID is basically a list of DOIs, or it's a list of RORs, and RORs are a list of DO. You can use each of them to point to each other. And it's not to say that RIDs can't necessarily do that. I do know that, from the Canadian perspective here, where, we have a very similar PID setup to what the US has, or at least in terms of what Lyrasis is running. We run an ORCID consortium, we run a data site consortium. We're also looking toward the development of a national PID strategy. And we're not actively using or centralizing or supporting RRIDs at this stage. So it could be sort of an institutional inertia thing. It could be which of the PID organizations have the most robust community to practice within the centralizing national PID strategy efforts. So it could be entirely just that we're doing the work to look into RRIDs, and maybe we'll discover that it's very easy to interoperate with the others. But from where I know at least we started in Canada, it's been a lot of sort of starting from the ORCID and data site and building out. And that includes looking at RAID, and that includes looking at RRIDs. So I think in these presentations, again, not to speak for the US context at all, often we focus on those interoperating central PID registration agencies that we work very closely with. But yeah, again, I think RRIDs are very important, and I'm not totally sure what factors are at play here. I'm not sure how interoperable they are with the other PIDs, how their APIs play with the other PID APIs. But for me, that would be one of the biggest factors to consider.
Well, that's a really great point. Thanks, John. But that kind of brings up another point. Maybe there should be like a outreach, to these groups so that you guys can interoperate and keep them together. Because in science field, like the authenticity of the reagent is very important. So giving a PID to a resource is critical. That's why big publishers like ourselves are pushing for this start table. Then you have to put the RID. So it's a matter of like a collaborating. Maybe you guys should reach out to RID and start discussing APIs, kind of cross-referencing each other so they can I'm sure the organization that makes this reagents or resources will have so why not connect them together? Maybe they can add their record into RID. So it's just a matter of a collaboration. And the more we kind of connect them together, the better networking, machine actionability becomes more practical and more usable.
Yeah, I think these are all great points and a big reason why we are having this call to kind of bring some stuff like this up to the forefront, and hear different perspectives. Any other thoughts or questions on this?
Yeah, I think Sheila, there's a follow-up kind of that's related to that.
Okay.
Do you have any guidance for assigning a PID to something like a specific instrument at a specific institution? So example, a city scanner at the Natural History Museum.
I guess I would need to know more details to give very detailed instructions, but you can see that instruments are included, as part of the data site DOI schema. So that could be used. If there, there may be other identifiers that could be used, like we were talking about the RRID. If somebody wanted to assign a data site DOI to an instrument, I would recommend going and looking at the data site metadata schema to see what types of information need to be included in that DOI metadata for the instrument. Yes, Tanya.
Right, so that was my question. I just wanted
Okay.
to follow up. So I've seen DOIs or some type of PID for an instrument. So I don't know, a CT scanner of this model made by this company. And then I've seen PIDs for institutions. And what I'm looking for is the combination of the two. It's like this instrument at this institution, because that could then be used to say, I have done a scan or I have done an experiment with this specific instrument, and it's not kind of generic, right? Like I have a Oral-B toothbrush, but I'm using the Oral-B toothbrush in my home to take care of my teeth, and these are the results that I've found.
Yes, absolutely. I think there is a field in the metadata for creating a DOI for the instrument to indicate the institution responsible for that instrument. And then again, that research resources section of ORCID could be another place where that information is connected to the individual who is using that instrument from that institution. So yeah, the research resources metadata, get that up on the screen again. It's taking a minute to load. So the ROR ID for the institution providing the resource would be included on the individual's ORCID record. And then there are, this example has a DOI for, I think, the project that this was used for, but there are identifier fields in the research resources section where you could put the identifier for the actual instrument that was being used here.
Okay.
Melissa, I see a hand up.
Yeah, I put it in the chat and I'm just trying to think this through. If this was an ORCID record that I was looking at and the resource was listed on there, to me, it doesn't insinuate use of the resource. It insinuates I wrote the grant to get this instrument, or I am the core that owns this instrument. So, I mean, is there somewhere, it's very hard for me to see, and our institution doesn't have it. Is there something that insinuates usage? Because I think this is awkward if it is not.
My understanding is that this section of the ORCID record is supposed to indicate usage of a resource.
Okay. I mean, I think as a user that is looking at this, I don't know if it was user tested, if people would really understand that that's what it means.
Got it. So it's a little confusing.
Because everything else on your ORCID record is like, I wrote this. You know what I mean?
I get what you're saying. Yeah, I think anything that was actually created by the individual would be in the works section of the ORCID record, whereas the research resource section is more about the resources that the person used associated with the projects that they were working on to kind of track those connections.
Okay,
But
I guess my
that's
comment
great
is,
feedback. Yeah,
yeah,
that's great feedback.
I don't think an average person would understand that at all.
Melissa, I'm with you. I second what you're saying. That unless there's two separate sections, like if you put in a grant and you got a mass spec or a new instrument to help in your research, that's what I thought that this would be. And then if you just happen to farm out some analyses to something else, what I'm hearing from Sheila is that that would also show up if they had the facility had an ID as well.
Yeah, and this section of ORCID is really only being used by some facilities. Like it's not being widely used right now. But for example, we're seeing IMSL here, but I know like Oak Ridge National Lab, for example, is another one that I've seen. So when people, you know, apply to use the facilities at Oak Ridge National Lab, they get asked for their ORCID ID. The lab takes that, figures out what they did at the facility and adds that to their research resources. But the organization would have to set this up. It's not just something that would happen automatically.
Yeah, I could see if this was maybe clarified that folks like at our cores would be really interested, because I know they're always trying to track who's using their stuff. And so
Yeah.
I think the idea behind it makes sense, and that could be really valuable. But I think how it currently is, it is confusing.
Okay.
And I think that it would be confusing trying to explain this to like our cores here.
Okay.
Yeah, and this came up actually when exactly what Beth was saying is what we were trying to do. The cores needed to track their usage, and so we ended up doing an RRID for that reason, and then having the researchers put that in and track it that way, because no, they didn't understand this. So
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sheila. We do have some other questions. We may not be able to go through all of them. But some other questions here. Can you talk a little bit more about what agencies meant grant DOIs?
I can talk about that actually. I have to find that information though. Hold on one second.
No worries.
I can share a list of funders that have registered at least 100 grant DOIs. So let me copy this. I think this is it. Oh, no, there was one I missed. Okay. Oh, come on. Sorry. Sorry, I'm having copy and paste issues. Okay, well, it'll be in two parts, but for anybody who is curious, here are some of the funders that are actively assigning more than 100 grant DOIs so far. There's a few more. So that kind of gives you an idea. Like I said, it's kind of a relatively new thing.
Thank you, Sheila. Okay, and other questions as well. Let me see. It's kind of a similar kind of questions, but do we have a list of publishers that write peer review activity to ORCID IDs?
Oh, that's one I don't have a list for. But yeah, that's a good question. I can try to get that. I don't have that information on hand.
Great. And
That's a good question. I think any
yeah.
questions that we can't answer or don't have time to answer on this call, because we only have a few minutes left, we'll try to get answers and share those out when we share the recording and slides.
Wonderful. And something related to that as well, that basically I was under the impression that only Claritin and one other had automated reviewer. So I haven't seen that article publishers sends over that information. So that's kind of related to that peer review activity as well. So we could take a look at that too.
Yeah, most of the peer review activity that gets added to ORCID records is coming through Web of Science, which used to be Publons, but like Publons is part of Web of Science. So that's the main kind of thing I've seen. There's also a peer review functionality in OJS. So if you're using OJS for any open journals, there's an ORCID integration that can allow for getting that peer reviewer information onto people's ORCID records. So Web of Science and OJS are really the two that I'm most familiar with. So the workflow does go through Web of Science. It's not like the publisher directly writing that to ORCID. But yeah, we can look more into those details of how that works.
All right, and I think we have just a few more minutes left. It's probably a good one to just do one more question or something that you can talk about. The other kind of other questions that's keeps coming up is also the default when it comes to organizational IDs in ORCID. So ROAR, GRID, and Ringgold, for example. So there might be some confusion on what the default is and how you can use them. So if you're using affiliation manager, or if you're using the drop-down menu, if you're adding employment affiliation in your ORCID record.
Yeah, so ROAR is kind of the new default in ORCID. GRID is going away. So GRID was used to kind of get ROAR started, and then Ringgold is a proprietary identifier. But right now in ORCID, if an organization has a ROAR ID, that should be the default for whether it's getting added via API or if a person is adding it themselves with the dropdown. We can include more information about that when we send out the notes. And I'm seeing a few questions about, is NIH or NSF going to start using grant DOIs? I don't know. I think they are thinking about it, talking about it, considering it. I know the Department of Energy is one of the agencies that assigned grant DOIs. So federal agencies are starting to do it, or at least think about it. So we'll just have to hold on and wait and see what they end up deciding. In the interest of time, though, it is the hour. So I just want to say thank you, everybody, for coming and thinking about these things, bringing up questions and discussion topics. Really appreciate everybody's input. We'll make sure to get all of the contributions that are in the chat kind of included into our notes doc and get the Q&A kind of recorded there too. And we'll share this recording and the slides. And I think when we send out the information, we'll also maybe point people to the PID forum or somewhere where we can continue these conversations too. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a great day.